Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 363, Dissolving Yourself. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are here for a mid-series check-in in our spirituality series.
Seventh inning stretch.
What is that? Seventh inning? Well, yeah, seventh inning, maybe more like the fourth inning.
Maybe, I think sixth, because there's been 5 episodes in the series. So we're like close to seventh inning stretch.
Okay, but I think there are more than 9 innings. We're going into extra innings in this series.
Fine.
But before we do, just a quick plug for our upcoming series of Anyeshiva classes, which are launching in just about 2 weeks, including with our guest last week, Shefa Gold. And like I said last week in the intro, if you listen to that episode, you are definitely going to want to take that class. So if you want to see what classes we have, go to judaismunbound.com/classes. And there you will discover that Lex is going to be teaching about Jewish discontinuity. I'm going to be teaching about Moses as mythology, about leading people through chaos. And we also have Shefa Gold teaching about the call of love, as we discussed last week, and Sarah Bunin Ben Nur on speaking Jewish around the globe, on Jewish languages from all over the world. Amazing, fascinating stuff. And also Sarah Eifler from Jewish Veg teaching on plant-based Judaism. So it's really an incredible offering of classes, as the Anyeshiva always is. But we really hope that you'll check it out at judaismunbound.com/classes. And also about the Anyeshiva, Lex has been kind of teasing this a little bit over the last few weeks at the end of the episode, and people have been asking me about this, meaning that people out there actually listen to the end of the episode, which I'm so excited always to hear about. And we have been teasing some news about the Anyeshiva, so we are going to be launching an Anyeshiva certificate, where if you take a certain number of classes, you will be able to be a certified Unbound Jew, title to be determined. That is part of what we're going to discuss later. But we are excited to be building a cohort of people out there who are engaged not only in taking 1 or 2 classes at the Anyeshiva, but in a serious program where they, meaning you, are going to be studying deeply and engage in relationship with one another and with us, and really building a community of people that are doing what we've been trying to do over the last 7 years or so, but now there's just going to be so many more of you. So we're really excited about that, and we're going to be talking about that in this episode. But before we do, let's start talking about spirituality. And honestly, Lex, I am still kind of confused by the whole thing.
Look, I've been known to say that confusion is a great emotion because it tends to precede realization. Most of the times I've learned something big in my life, it's come directly after confusion where I didn't understand a thing. That's why we're so big on unlearning in the Anyeshiva. Like, you unlearn as a pre-step to then learning something new, but you have to sort of deconstruct in order to reconstruct. Anyway, I like the confusion. I think I feel a little less of it maybe, but I've been enjoying immersing in these different approaches to spirituality. And you said some phrasing that I want to dwell with because I think it points to something in the realm of spirituality. You were talking about our Anyeshiva courses, and you said, Lex is going to be teaching about Jewish discontinuity. And you also said Shefa Gold is going to be teaching about the call of love. And you said there were a bunch of abouts. I will speak for myself, and I think for some of our other teachers, I tend to say I'm teaching Jewish discontinuity. The about makes something a meta conversation. To learn about something is to be outside of it and analyze it. You're placing yourself as an observer. People don't tend to say, I'm reading about the Lord of the Rings. They're reading the Lord of the Rings. Like, they're in it. And we know as a reader, we're not actually in it, right? Like, we're reading. But part of what I've been soaking in through all of these guests is that spiritual work, spirituality, spiritual practice largely boils down to being in it. The it might be sitting in silence. The it might be chanting in a group. The it might be justice practice. The it might be, to quote Josh Fagelson, watching 30 Rock. all of those, to do them spiritually is to lose the about to some extent. And my hope for people in my classes is that they actually emerge feeling not that they spent 12 weeks talking about X, but actually that they spent 12 weeks immersing in whatever the X is, this time Jewish discontinuity. Spirituality is not just a topic that we're talking about in this unit. It's something we're like swimming in, something that we're experiencing, and not just something that we're watching. Because to me, that's actually, when I think of my own spiritual practices, it's when I transcend that sense that I am outside of X, that I am, watching a group of people sing. Sure, I'm one of them. But when I feel that I'm really doing the practice, it's when I'm in the chant, in the silence, in the meditation, in the whatever the exercise is.
But just to clarify what you're saying on our series, for example, and also on the Yeshiva, are you saying that with regard to this series of episodes, we are doing spirituality or we're doing about spirituality? Because I feel this series of episodes is actually about spirituality. Other than last week with Shefa Gold, I haven't felt that we're doing too much actual spirituality on the show. When Shefa Gold started to sing and to chant, I really felt like, we were actually doing some spirituality. But I'm wondering, and I'm also wondering whether you're talking about your Yeshiva class, that you are kind of suggesting that you're doing spirituality in the class, or you're just kind of saying that part of why you don't like to generally say teaching about is because you're doing something more than just teaching at a remove, whether your class is actually counts as spirituality or not.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You caught something, which is I did just imply that our podcast might be for people, but I implied that it might be itself a spiritual practice. And I said that because we're talking about spirituality, that we are talking about it. I think it would be dishonest to be like, this in a really high level sense has exercised our spiritual muscles in the way, I think that would be discrediting all the wonderful spiritual work that people do more consciously, more thoughtfully with their bodies, with their hearts, with their neshamas, etc. And we get notes from people, whether it's in our spirituality unit or otherwise, telling us that this is a spiritual practice of theirs to dwell in this podcast. So I'm sort of half answering in both directions and copping out. But for those who are experiencing this series or our podcast more generally with a kind of rhythm, I mentioned that I think practice needs to have a rhythm to it. It's not a spiritual practice if you do it once. It has to have a rhythmic pattern. I don't care if it's weekly, monthly, whatever. But for me, I'd say I mostly meant, when I teach a course, my goal is for it to be a spiritual experience. That's not my only goal, but one of my goals is that people they'll lose a sense of separation between them and the material, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's almost, to use B'nai Lappi's terminology of being a player on the field. I want people not to think that they are in the stands watching. And I think candidly, even people who do participate in Jewish spaces a lot of the time, we're in it half.
Yeah.
We're singing along, but we're not losing ourselves. We're not so in Kabbalat Shabbat singing on Friday night that we forget where we are. I do actually occasionally have ecstatic experiences where I'm so deeply in it that I'm not even thinking about something else. And that makes it sound really big. I think I have that sensation in movies too, where I'm watching a movie and I don't even really exist anymore. I'm in what's happening on the screen and nothing else in my world matters. That's why I love it, because there's a way in which I inhabit a different world in that time. And I think the spiritual is a way of sort of practicing that achievement.
Well, you're saying so many different things. I think that they connect. But, ultimately what I want to do here, and I think Josh Fagelson mentioned this approach, but it's Maimonides' approach of negative theology, right, of trying to describe God by describing what God is not. And part of what I'm trying to be careful of is not describing spirituality in such a way that everything is Jewish spirituality. So just putting that to the side, ultimately I want to figure out what it is exactly that we're talking about. Maybe we don't have to. Maybe everything can be spirituality, but I'm not sure that I want that to be the case, because I want to feel like I'm doing spirituality when I want to, and I want to feel like there are times when I'm not doing spirituality, and that's also okay. I will say that just early on what you were saying, it made me wonder, like, can you create a spiritual experience accidentally? And I think the answer is definitely yes. I am not super conscious of trying to create that, although I think I'm trying to create something a little bit more than informational. So there's something. I don't know if I'd call it spirituality, but yeah, I am intentionally trying to have this podcast be something where you can really feel like it itself is a Jewish experience, not only an analytical discussion about Judaism. For me, I have what I would define as a spiritual experience when I listen to a podcast of biblical proportions and other podcasts about the Bible that I love, even though I think for the most part, their hosts do not intend them to be spiritual experiences. They are trying to give more analytical, informational podcasts, but listening to a podcast about the Bible tends to be able to sweep me into the past. And so, like you were saying earlier, I don't necessarily feel only that I'm thinking about it. I feel like I'm somehow in it. So I actually feel like I'm taken in a certain kind of a time machine when I listen to those podcasts about the Bible. And it's fair to call that a spiritual experience. I'm thinking more broadly about the topic of Jewish spirituality as we've been trying to explore it here. And I guess I'm wondering whether Jewish spirituality is just one way to be Jewish and a person can be a non-spiritual Jew, or are we trying to kind of explore the possibility that we should vastly expand the definition of spirituality such that most people would be able to relate to the concept and say, actually, yeah, I do experience Judaism as part of my spiritual life. It's just that I've never defined spiritual in the way that you're defining it now. I've always understood myself to be not really very spiritual as a Jew, but now I'm coming to understand that the way in which I didn't consider myself spiritual was only in this particular way of being a spiritual or religious Jew that was being presented to me, and I didn't really relate to that, so I figured I'm a gastronomic Jew or whatever. And then we're saying, oh no, actually gastronomic Judaism can be a form of spiritual Judaism. So, right. But again, I worry that we tend to define something so broadly that it starts to lose a certain meaning.
It's funny because we're just having the same conversation we've had 90 times on this podcast about Torah. And I'm saying that not because that makes this one inherently not valuable or something. I think this is still valuable. But given that I have a choice between erring on an expansive definition of spirituality or spiritual practice that has the danger of being so expansive that it doesn't mean so much, I choose that every day twice over the narrow definition that might have the danger, the opposite danger of being insufficiently broad to meet what many people want in their lives. I'd rather define it more expansively. And also, a lot of things I experience as spiritual are things that other people generally don't define as spiritual at the top of the list. So I mentioned, watching TV. I was just speaking with our New Voices Judaism Unbound fellow, Catherine Horowitz, about pop culture as a form of religious practice, about especially rhythmic watching of TV shows. We were both talking about how we actually gravitate towards certain kinds of ritual with watching a show a certain time each week, even though we have the ability today to watch it all sorts of different times and binge and whatever. And I mentioned blood donation. That's also, look, Josh Fagelson, when I said blood donation for me as a spiritual practice, he didn't say no, how dare you? And I don't think very many people in the world, even spiritual practitioners, would say, how dare you? But it's not what we think of. We have a disconnect between stuff that matters a lot in our lives that we take seriously, that makes our body feel a certain way. And I'm not just referring to the sensation of blood leaving my body. I mean that I am dissolving separation between the sense of self and the sense of everyone else. If I were to distill my definition of spirituality, mine would be the sensation that I have dissolved separation between my illusion of self and the broader world. The sense I have walking around every day that I am a self, that I am Lex and not the chair I'm sitting on or the screen in front of me or the you that I'm talking to, that sense is in fact illusion. And now people can ask me, is that a Jewish concept? Is that a Buddhist concept? Is that a human concept? I came to it from a mixture of places, some of which are very squarely Jewish. There are plenty of Hasidic notions of the divine, where we are not really discrete selves in a full sense. We are part of one godliness, basically. For me, going and giving blood, it's not just spirituality because I think it's important. I want to be clear about that. There are things that are important in the world that might not be precisely what I call spirituality or spiritual practice. The specific thing about blood donation is that I am doing something that dissolves the idea that my body, physically, my actual blood, is me and not somebody else. Something comes from my body once every 16 weeks. It leaves and it embeds itself in a different person's body. And I get a notification on my phone when that happens. I don't know who it is. And I actually like that I don't know who it is, because if I knew who it was, then I'd be connecting to that one person, right? But the fact that I don't know who it is, that makes the act of blood donation an act of connecting to all of humanity, potentially. I don't know which I mean, like, realistically, it's somebody in the state of Rhode Island. Like, this is but like, even that, like, I'm connecting potentially to anybody in the geographic area that I call home. That increases my sense of connection to that geographic area. It increases my sense of connection to the people around me. And it all comes because I've dissolved a sense that I am Lex and everybody else is separate from me. In my blood, there's nothing that I strive for more than that. And that's why, if I'm singing in a group of people, I'm seeking to lose a sensation of Lexness and instead be inhabiting a sensation of the we that is in that room. That's why there's this notion, bitul hayesh, that's the Jewish angle that informs this, like the loss of self. I was initially really resistant to that, and I had yelling matches with the Chabad guy I was learning with. He actually really liked it. A lot of Chabad people are really into this. But it was because I was formed in a society that super cherishes the notion of self and teaches us that finding your true self, quote unquote, being yourself, all these self notions, that's what spirituality is. I'm not looking for my true self. That, to me, is the essence here. And so what you said is, like, could anything be spiritual practice, or could you accidentally do a spiritual practice? If it achieves that, yeah. If reading a book, if watching a TV show, if watching a movie, all things we trivialize and call not spiritual. In many ways, I think stuff involving screens, our society has taught us is the least spiritual. If doing that helps you dissolve your notion of self because you become part of the we that is the people who are fans of that show, that's great.
So first of all, I like the definition a lot of something spiritual or spirituality being that which helps us dissolve the self. That when we experience, let's call it for now spirituality, what we're experiencing is a dissolution of the self and a sense of oneness with the greater universe. Now, then I wonder, like, okay, so we could take a few different examples of how that happens, and you've given us a bunch. One is deeply physical. Your blood is being removed from you and being put into the wider universe, and then you get a notification that it actually happened, and so you're actually sort of experiencing this, like, physical melding of the universe and not just having your discrete self. Then you gave the example of singing. I will say that I was most moved so far in our show. I felt it happened to me the most last week when we talked to Shefa Gold and she started to do her chanting. And by the way, she mentioned that she has an app, and I downloaded it. I think I might have even downloaded it while we were recording. You know me, like, I tend to be pretty heady, but I can have a very strong reaction to certain spiritual experiences and not others. And that particular one, the idea of the chant, really moved me. And it was so much so that I kind of feel like I got the sense that Shefa Gold is in a little way trying to expand the way she's seen beyond chant. And she should have every right to do that. But, like, I'm a latecomer to the game, and probably many of our listeners also are. And we're like, hey, we just discovered this chant thing. It's pretty awesome. What do I do? Where do I go? So the idea for me of chant, as opposed to going to synagogue, which I hate, of saying these really long prayers that have many words, I felt much more drawn to the idea of saying fewer words over and over and over again. Now, that's me. I don't at all imagine, I'm not saying that chant good, synagogue bad. I'm putting out into the world this wondering that says, are there more people like me out there? And part of that has to do with what you're saying, that maybe different spiritual modalities work for different people. Using psychedelic drugs, for example, as a way of achieving that sense of the dissolution of self. Obviously, that works for some people, and others find it really unpleasant. Your sense that you've talked about, that you have a kind of a spiritual experience with sports or movies, I definitely relate to that in the sense that I have definitely been to movies or concerts or sports experiences where I have had this almost out-of-body experience where I'm one with the crowd and whatever. Part of me wonders then, can we take it one more level? And we've talked about this a million times on the podcast also, and say, is there a difference between a spiritual experience that has deep purpose, that, in other words, that it ultimately makes the world a better place, is what I'm talking about, versus a spiritual experience that's sort of a dissolution of self, but ultimately it doesn't really contribute to the world? Is that a lesser form of spiritual experience, or is it a different form of spiritual experience because it still potentially prepares you to have less of a sense of selfhood, right? I mean, it still is giving you that transcendent experience, maybe for this purpose, not so significant in terms of the larger history of the world, but at least it is kind of preparing you to not be a person who's gone through the world saying the only thing that I've ever experienced is me, myself.
Let's take for a second, I'm not saying everybody has to agree with this, but let's take as a given that I, Lex, do believe that the rhythmic watching of a TV show, including a trashy TV show, a reality TV show, could in fact be spiritual experience. For me, it's always could, right? Like for me, spiritual experience, it's a way of describing how you are doing an activity. It's not actually describing the activity itself. Singing in a group is not inherently spirituality if it's not actually achieving that dissolution of self. But let's say in potential, watching The Bachelor every week and following on Twitter, hashtag Bachelor Nation, and all the things people are saying about this trashy reality show, it does in fact make a mono unit, a self, part of a millions strong unit. So it's dissolving self. I do think that is less important than participating in collective action to combat climate change. Participating in collective action to combat climate change is definitionally, by what I described, like one of the most straightforward examples of quote unquote spirituality, because you are making yourself less a self and more one node in a broader set of nodes that are all of humanity and really that are like all of inhabitation on this planet, or at least current inhabitation. That is totally a spiritual experience. And yeah, I want people to do that more than I want them to watch TV shows. It's just, it behooves us to recognize that there actually is depth and meaning in things that we do in our day-to-day lives, and notice that, oh, if I sought for it to be a way for me to connect myself, quote unquote, in my view, but myself to broader communities, that would be kind of cool. What if when I'm watching a baseball game, a basketball game of my favorite team that's in the town I grew up in and that I don't live in anymore, what if afterwards I took a look at what's on the front page of the newspaper in that local town and saw if there were ways that I, as a diasporic, for me, Milwaukeean, could play a role in some meaningful political, like, is watching the Milwaukee Brewers inherently a spiritual act? No, of course not. Of course not. I want to be clear. Like, if I look for the ways in which it could potentially unlock something beyond self, unlock something collective, unlock something that ties me to a community, which ideally is a gateway drug to tying one's self beyond just a local community, but to the world. I mean, the danger of this, by the way, like, it is a spiritual practice, in my view, and I'm following like Robert Bella and others on this, to be super nationalist. You are tying yourself to a much broader whole that is not about you through patriotism and everything. Like, I'm not somebody who's really rah-rah about patriotism or nationalism. It is absolutely a religious kind of act or a spiritual kind of act, but it's not one I'm super revved up about to have people pledging allegiance to flags. If there's a way for fidelity to a community, to a nation, to be a lead-in to a fidelity to all of creation, That's good.
Yes.
But I think you need to show that a commitment to nationalism doesn't inherently mean you're sort of against all the other nations, right?
Right.
That would be bad. I don't want a world where everybody walking around is against 99% of the rest of humanity and pro their little sector. By the way, part of why I really buckle into Jewishness is because I think that's a practice. Like participating in a community that is 15 million people or whatever it is worldwide and focusing more on that collective than myself in certain senses. I'm not saying that that's like a super noble thing I'm doing. I think it's what a lot of Jews do. That can be a gateway drug too. I think it comes with the same danger of nationalism, where you could prioritize Jewish people over everybody else. But I think that at the very least, we have to be setting up nodes of existence that are not just ourself, because we live in capitalism that is premised on a strong sense of self. We know the dangers when everybody walking around is primarily looking out for number one, or maybe looking out for their nuclear family. That's not a society I'm particularly interested in. So I buckle into frameworks that try to transcend those smallest units.
Yeah, it is funny. It reminds me of a conversation I was just having this morning with a friend, basically about where does somebody give their philanthropic money. And we were talking about whether they would be good if they gave some money to Jewish causes. And I said, I think it would be good if they gave to Jewish causes that tend to inspire people to want to give outside the Jewish world, to all sorts of things like hunger and health and all kinds of things of that nature. My argument was that if Judaism is working well, then it would help people transcend their Jewishness and say, and therefore I want to work to make the broader world a better place. And I was suggesting that these folks that we were talking about themselves had a Jewish upbringing of that nature, that their commitment to giving philanthropy so broadly was because their Jewish upbringing had done a really good job of making them feel connected to this wider world. In other words, that it kind of dissolved both the self and the larger self of the Jewish people. And they said something back to me like, yeah, I think it really would be good if this friend gave more to Jewish identity stuff. And I said, no, I don't want Jewish identity. Like I said to him, I'm actually not that in favor of Jewish identity per se. I'm not interested in Jewish identity. And to put that in your language, that's just a more of a collective selfness. And when you're saying nationalism, you're saying, yeah, you do dissolve the personal physical self, but for the favor of a larger selfness of the nation. And I think a lot of people think about Judaism in those terms. They think about, the goal is to dissolve yourself. You yourself are not so important, but your commitment to the Jewish people, that's what's important. And I want to really make a distinction there and say, the spiritual experience that I'm looking for is one in which both my lone self is dissolved, and I think that Judaism can be a really powerful vehicle through which to do that, but only if the next step is the sort of dissolution of the Jewish selfness for the sense of selfness with the whole universe. And by the way, I wonder to some extent whether that version of Jewish spirituality, that version of Judaism, is actually a new version of Judaism that is what I'm looking for, in the sense that it really is a certain kind of fusion of elements that have previously been part of Judaism with elements that at least we think of as having previously been part of Buddhism. Not to say that you can't find anywhere in Judaism these various concepts. You probably can if you look hard enough, and certainly in the more mystical traditions. But I guess I want to say that I think that Buddhism has done it better, focusing on the dissolution of self. And that is not a diss on Judaism. That is an inspiration to say, what would it look like if Judaism and Buddhism kind of had a baby? And I wonder whether we just have a discomfort in the Jewish space of being fully willing to say that that's what we're doing, even as I think we see a lot of the practices that we're talking to folks about being very much inspired by, and probably in terms of people's, not necessarily the people we're talking to, but the earlier founders of this work being themselves directly inspired by Buddhism, by Hinduism. And to me, that's a really good thing.
there's a way in which the question of, am I an individual, like primarily, or am I primarily one cog in a broader system? I think that's a question that I hesitate to say, like, it's just a question that all humans ask. I don't make a lot of claims about, like, across all societies, we all have the same questions. I don't think that's true. I do think that the question of, like, am I a me or am I mostly part of a we? To use, like, cliche language, but I do think that's something that comes up in a lot of different cultures. But I want to name that, like, I use the word dissolution of self, right? Dissolution. You asked if Jewishly this is, you know, for some set of reasons we might not be fully comfortable with this. Of course we're not. Because the word dissolution is really scary when you're part of a group of people that people have tried to dissolve. There are actual, real historical circumstances where people have sought to dissolve, to lead to the dissolution of Jews. So saying that Judaism is, like in the way you did, you were talking about how, like, if we think our primary allegiance is to the Jewish people, that's just sort of that's just a bigger self. It's not a self in the sense of one person, but it's a bigger non-universalist level of commitment that still means you are not, if you're committed 100% to the Jewish people, you could potentially be uncommitted or anti-committed to the remainder of existence. That's not to say that people necessarily are, but, like, people can format their lives according to that principle, that they are fully committed to the Jewish people, and any others who are not part of that people or who stand in the way, they are not part of that broader group. And so I am saying, like, I want to dissolve that sense of difference also between Jewish people and the rest of the world. I'm in an interfaith relationship. A lot of my life is about what it looks like to be committed literally, both to Jewish people, like actual Jewish human beings, and the Jewish people, and literally through vows I took and papers I signed and ceremony I did to a person who isn't Jewish. And I'm not saying everybody has to marry somebody who isn't Jewish or, like, be in a deep relationship with somebody who isn't Jewish, but there is a way in which combining concrete commitments to a sector of the world, Jews, with concrete commitments to those who are specifically davka, to use a Jewish term, not in that sector, that's what I strive for. There are limits to that, and I want to be clear to folks who are ready to yell at me like, but Lex, we need some amount of differentiation. I know, but I'm saying one side of this without naming the fullness of it.
I'm really quite excited by the direction that you've taken us here on the whole question of the dissolution of self. I'll just put in, this is not my idea. This is something that Hasidism talks about and others, that if you think about the Shema prayer, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Hear, O Israel, you know, Yahweh, our God, Yahweh is one. But there's another way to think about it as oneness, right? And that the true nature of what we are going to call God is the oneness of all things. And the idea that I should dissolve as an individual into that oneness is the highest understanding of what the truth of the universe is. And even as a scientist, I buy that because we're all the stuff of the cosmos. And so there's so many layers in which I think that can be a very powerful idea. And I look forward to exploring that more. I'm thinking, though, too, as you've been talking, like I've been thinking about our plans for the Yeshiva, and I'm not just making this as a segue. Like, it's actually what I've been thinking about, that, first of all, like you talked about, that this is Judaism unbound. This is about trying to dissolve the boundaries, many boundaries, but among them, the boundaries that keep Judaism as this kind of small, bounded thing, as opposed to something that is part of the oneness of all things. But the other piece of the dissolution of self that I feel like connects to what we're doing with the Yeshiva is that you and I have been trying to dissolve you and me as defining this work, Judaism Unbound, and this larger work. We have been trying to figure out how can we fully give that work over to the world of those who listen to this podcast and beyond them, who are interested in doing that work and who might be holding themselves back from doing that work, in part because of not thinking that they know enough or feeling unauthorized or whatever may be holding folks back. And the first step in doing that was the Yeshiva itself to say, can we start to invite people into a more intense experience with this material from this perspective? And I think that the next step in the Yeshiva, as I see it, is to try to get people, again, I don't think it's that we are authorizing them. I think it's that we want to get them to a point where they feel authorized to step into this work at the same level that we are doing it at. Ultimately, I think that's the goal of this, of the Yeshiva in general, and of this next phase of creating some kind of certificate program that says, hey, you've actually spent a lot of time in the Yeshiva, and therefore we are happy to certify you, I guess, as a fellow Unbounder. I don't know. How do you think about all that, Lex?
I know that I'm really excited about this certificate program. Just to really put it crystal clear for those for whom our rambly style is not so helpful, we're launching a certificate program. We're launching applications for it now, which is super exciting. If you're out there thinking, I would like to actively devote a meaningful amount of my time in the next couple years to learning in Yeshiva courses, doing unlearning, doing learning, and emerging as something that we would term, we're still figuring out the language. I kept on throwing like certified Jewish heretic, and Dan's like, that's too aggressive. We're not doing that. But like some kind of certified unbound Jew.
Wait, just to clarify, my point is trying to say that I don't think it's heresy. Not that there's anything wrong with heresy, but that I don't want this stuff to be deemed only heresy. I want it to be the next Jewish future, so to speak.
Yeah, so the certificate program is going to be a chance to take basically 4 or 5 Yeshiva courses if you take full semester one. There's going to be a lot of flexibility in it. So if you want to take 2 full semester courses, but then take a whole slew of our short 3-week options, that will also be an option. There's a lot of different avenues we're creating so that people can fit this to their own life schedules, to their own desires. This is not like a regimented, here are the classes you must take situation, but we are excited to have a real cohort of people, like Dan said, that are not just, the two of our voices, who are going to be able to operate with a serious familiarity with our Judaism Unbound lens. They will have learned from us, but also from many of our awesome guest teachers. We've got a sprinkling of classes that are devoted to sort of inside Jewish texts, which is to say like Torah and Talmud and other like authorized Jewish texts, but looking at them through our Unbound lens. People will have the chance to do some unlearning kinds of courses where we're asking big questions about what Judaism even is and isn't. And we're going to be really excitedly amplifying the work of Jewish studies scholars too. And people in this certificate program are going to have the chance to learn from scholars of Jewish studies at various different subject matters, but in a context that isn't necessarily as intimidating as a university lecture where you're surrounded by people who have PhDs and are asking like 501 level questions when you want to be at 201. We're going to be doing all of that. And so if you feel called to that act of self-authorization, here I am throwing around self words when I just said we should dissolve selves. If you feel called to this chance to immerse deeply in Judaism Unbound style learning for a couple of years, this is a real chance for you to do just that. And most importantly, not just to sort of experience that learning as you, but to be part of a real community, like a capital C community of people that know each other, that connect regularly, that are all doing this work together. Then this program is probably up your alley.
Yeah, so stay tuned in the weeks ahead for more detail on this. We're going to fully announce all the elements of this, all the deadlines for it in the weeks ahead. So stay tuned for that. Lex, one thing that I wanted to talk about here, we've been debating what to call this thing. And just to put it out, I mean, like you said it, like you suggested, how about a certificate in Jewish heresy? And I said, I don't want to call it heresy because I don't want people to only think it's heresy. I want it to be able to be understood that this is the seed of the future. Maybe all heresy is the seed of the future, but it felt to me like I don't necessarily want to call it that. And today you actually suggested an idea of something related to boundary crossing, which actually the word Ivri or Hebrew is rooted in the word for to cross over. The idea that Jews are these people who cross boundaries, whether those boundaries are rivers or deserts or other kinds of more spiritual boundaries or less physical boundaries, I guess I should say. To me, I said, I think that's a good direction. Right now, as our placeholder, we've been talking about it as a certificate in Unbound Judaism. Maybe that's what it'll be called with a colon about something about boundary crossings. But we really do want to invite folks to make suggestions to think about it with us.
I still do have a soft spot for various forms of heresy. And I will shout out that, Ivri ties to this idea of crossing over. The English word that is most succinct, I think, for crossing over is transgress. And so my arguments for why I like the heretic word, because the same word for crossing boundaries is the words for breaking rules, transgressing laws.
Well, in Hebrew too, Aveira is from the root of Ivri.
Yeah. Anyway, there's a lot of layers here. And the other thing is, I love the word chutzpah. We've used the word chutzpah a number of times on the show. And part of me thinks this is the chutzpah factory. But it's not really, and that's not really a certificate title. But those are my current thoughts. I mostly want to hear from everybody else. But I guess I just really feel called to say, you out there listening, you're certified, right? This certificate program, it's almost funny to call it that, because there's nothing we could do more that implies we hold some power and can grant it to other people than make a certificate program that certifies people as authentic. My first relationship to the word certificate was that I was really into sports cards and sports memorabilia. And when you get autographed memorabilia, it comes with a certificate of authenticity. It proves that the signature is real. I don't think we need to say to any of you, oh, you're real. But we have learned over the years that as much as we want everybody to already feel authorized to futz around with Judaism, to play with their sacred chutzpah, to do their holy heresy or holy, future Judaism building, if we don't want to say heresy, as much as we say that to folks, there are people who still just, I don't know, there's this tendency to make themselves smaller than they could be. People with incredible visions of Judaism, people who are writing their own creative midrashes, incredible stories, launching Jewish text into new avenues. There are people tying Jewishness to social justice struggles of all sorts of varieties, people doing incredible liberatory work, and who still, at the end of the day, seem to feel this deference towards the quote-unquote authorities, rabbis or clergy or people with Jewish master's degrees or whatever it might be. And so my hope with this program is not that it does something that needs to be done, because I actually think it's unnecessary. The it being, not that the program's unnecessary, but I like that we're doing this program, but the idea that, we have this power to certify that in a better world would be unnecessary. But just that we allow people who do actually want to be able to say, I spent a couple years embedded in Judaism. I'm not just for people who want that defense mechanism against people who would say, oh, well, your new idea isn't authentic. You don't have the receipts. You don't have my certificate of authenticity that comes with the sports memorabilia. To be able to say, well, I spent a significant portion of my life in a number of spaces with dear friends and chavrutas that I've met over the course of the program. I created my own initiatives. That is something that I believe is needed just to help people take that real step from, I have permission, to I'm going to exercise the permission I have to shape Judaism.
B'nai Lappi talks about this a lot, that I don't know if it's all Buddhism or certain segments of Buddhism, that there's a thing where when you go to become a monk, you are ordained as soon as you enter the monastery, and then you study. I've been thinking about it, that this program is like at the end of The Wizard of Oz, when the wizard gives the Tin Man and the Scarecrow and the Cowardly Lion and gives them the awards, the medals that say that you have a brain and you have a heart and you have courage, that you actually had those all along. You didn't need the medal to get that, but maybe the medal helps to make you feel like you have it. And so in a way, that's what this is all about. And actually on the Oral Talmud, B'nai and I have been studying a set of stories about Hillel and Shammai, these proto-rabbis, and a Gentile comes to them to potentially become a convert to Judaism. One of those stories is really famous, like, tell me all of Judaism while I'm standing on one foot. But there are other stories there as well. And one of the things that I hadn't noticed before is that in all these cases, the potential convert tells them a certain condition, like I'll convert to Judaism if X, Y, and Z. And Hillel converts them and then starts to have the discussion about the condition, meaning that the person could have just converted to Judaism and not done any of that. And they would have still been a fully authorized Jew, according to Hillel. And essentially, that's what this is about. It's saying this is a program in which you are deemed by the program to be authorized on day one. I guess maybe we should issue the certificate before you study it all, but we're not ready to do that yet. But we are going to give you the certificate after a while, but we really believe it as the Wizard of Oz story, that it's probably in most cases going to be ratifying and affirming something that was already there. And by the way, this is for lay people, although I guess if you're a Jewish professional, you're also welcome to take these classes and get a certificate too. But this is aimed for people who are regular people who will want to be saying all the things that you said earlier, Lex, about how, yeah, I studied, I spent some time in this, and I've been thinking about Judaism, and I've got a community of fellow thinkers, and I have my seat here at the table by rights.
I've got an insufferable Lex wordplay of the day ready to go. I love your Wizard of Oz connection. And last week, Shefa Gold gave us some background on the chant that is known around the world. That's not an overstatement. It's been used in so many contexts, at least hundreds, maybe thousands at this point. Oz v'zimrat ya. What if it's the Wizard of Oz, Dan? What Oz meaning strength or power.
Yeah.
What if what we're doing is creating a pathway to build that strength, to build that sense of permission that ideally is already there, but just to go once again from that situation of, I've got this idea for the Jewish future. I've got this idea for how I could, with my beloved friends in my community, shift something, do something new, build something inspiring, to go from that to having that strength, that Wizard of Oz, that Oz, to actualize it. That's our hope. So that is going to be the note that we close this episode on. I know that we sort of pulled a sleight of hand where we started squarely focused on the spirituality unit that has been the crux of the last bunch of weeks. And then we went to the Anya Shiva. I do stand by what Dan said and what I would agree with, that the certificate program creates a way for people's relationship to Judaism Unbound to be more of a practice, to be something that is a regular part of their life, and that they do not just as an individual, but in community, that dissolves that sense of unitariness, of selfness, and creates a connection that is with others. And so for those of you out there that have really enjoyed our podcast, but it's been mostly in your ears and not shared experience with a bunch of friends, this is a pathway to create that collective. So please, all of the stuff we say at the end of every episode about being in touch with us, super true today, maybe extra true. So that's what I'll close with. A part of me is apologetic that we didn't fully go into the spirituality pieces on their own, but a reminder that unit will be continuing. Some amazing guests the next bunch of weeks, so stay tuned for all of those. But for all the ways to be in touch with us, whether it's about the questions of dissolution of self that we talked about, whether it's about the Anya Shiva certificate program in Unbound Judaism, here are the different avenues for being in touch. First, there's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com, including JudaismUnbound.com/certificate, where you can learn all about this program and submit your first stage in the application process as soon as now. You can actually do that now. And also there's on our website, JudaismUnbound.com/classes, to learn more about the Anya Shiva courses that are being offered specifically this semester. And also there's our email addresses. We love hearing from all of you. There's been a good flow lately of emails, and we encourage more of those, but Lex@JudaismUnbound.com and or Dan@JudaismUnbound.com for those. But with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.